Part of a series leading up to some hands-on soil health workshops later this year. The overall project is sponsored by North Central SARE. The overall goal of the project is to provide train-the-trainer professional development related to soil health and vegetable production. The project team is working with K-State Extension agents, NRCS personnel, and others. The goal of these webinars is to provide some fundamental information before the hands-on workshops in order to minimize classroom time at those hands-on events. After the workshops, later this fall and winter, there will be an online learning community to follow up in even more detail for those who are interested. So this particular webinar covers some nuts and bolts of vegetable diseases. The focus is on the diseases, but we'll touch on soil health and cover crops in some spots. So my name is Megan Kennelly, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Plant Pathology at Kansas State University. My appointment at K-State includes research, extension, and plant disease diagnosis for all the horticultural commodities, including vegetables. So the goals for the webinar are that after viewing, you will be able to know some tips on diagnosing vegetable diseases, understand the general categories of vegetable diseases and their basic biology, understand some general management practices, and then see how different tomatoes kind of fit together as a case study of the general information that I present. There's no way to cover all the plant diseases. There are many different kinds of vegetable crops, and each has its own set of diseases. Here is one reference that may be useful. It is the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide for Commercial Growers. It can be accessed online for free. We'll bring copies of it to view at the hands-on workshop, and we'll bring other references as well. And we'll put in links to this and other references on the Soil Health Bootcamp website. There are many things that can go wrong with plant health, including environmental stresses, nutritional imbalances, chemical injuries, insect damage, and the plant diseases, which are caused by microbes, including fungi, viruses, bacteria, and nematodes. These factors can be intertwined. For example, certain nutritional imbalances may make plants more prone to certain diseases, and some insects can spread disease-causing pathogens. So it's important to think about overall plant health management. In plant pathology, we have a concept called the disease triangle. For a disease to develop, three pieces need to come together. First, there has to be a susceptible plant, which is the host. Then we need a causal organism or the pathogen, such as fungus, bacteria, nematode, or virus. And then finally, the environment needs to be favorable to the disease. If one of those pieces is missing, you won't get a plant disease. So for preventing diseases, we can think about blocking the different sides of the triangle. For example, we can use resistant plant varieties that are not susceptible to some diseases. We can exclude the pathogen by using clean seed and clean transplants, and by culling out infected plants. And we can manipulate the environment to be less favorable to diseases, which usually means managing moisture and humidity. And I'll talk about all of these in more detail with some examples as we move along. Okay, so when it comes to diagnosing diseases, there are some things to consider. First, think about when you go to the doctor. The doctor usually asks you some questions like, when did the symptoms start? Can you describe these symptoms? Have you had these symptoms before? With plants, we also have some detective work to do. So most plant pathogens infect only a small range of host species, usually within one plant family. So observations on which plants, species, or which varieties are affected can be important. The planting date may be helpful, especially if we are correlating symptoms back to conditions at the time of planting. As I mentioned, many diseases are associated with too much moisture, either above or below ground. So information about rain, irrigation, or drainage problems at the site can be an important clue. Some information on prior chemical usage may be helpful, including information on both fertilizers and pesticides, both organic or conventional. And finally, the development of symptoms in space and time can reveal clues about the cause, especially getting a general sense of whether the problem is actually a disease or if it's an environmental stress. Okay, so let's talk a little more about spread in space and time. Let's pretend that this gray rectangle is a field and the little red dots are plants that are infected. Plant diseases do often start as individual plants or maybe clumps of plants, and then over time they will spread to neighboring plants. Or a disease might start at one edge of the field and then spread across, or some soil-borne diseases might start in one area and then spread in irrigation water down the slope from there, downhill. In contrast, if the pattern of symptoms is all in a straight line, that is more likely to be an abiotic stress. For example, there might be an accidental, like a double load of fertilizer just down one row that causes some burn on the plants. Or if the symptoms show up all at once across the field, or across multiple fields of different species of plants, that's more likely to be some kind of abiotic stress, like a sudden cold snap, misapplication of a pesticide or chemical across an entire field, or maybe flooded conditions across an entire field. Okay, so based on what we just talked about, do you think this is a disease or environmental stress? So you might have guessed it's a disease. It's very clumpy in its spatial distribution, and if we could go back in time, we'd probably see a few plants affected and then the disease spreading over time in those clumps. Here's another example. Here's a set of tomato plants showing some browning. Is this a disease or an abiotic stress? It might be hard to know. And one clue is the pattern in both space and time. And in this case, I actually have a photo from an earlier time point. So here we can see there's just one plant showing some slight distortion and stunting. The symptoms then spread throughout the planting. A closer look at these plants did reveal viral symptoms, and we ran a confirmatory test in the diagnostic lab. But the general pattern in space and time was also an important clue. If you need help diagnosing a plant problem, you can always contact a diagnostic laboratory, such as the one at K-State, and I won't go into details of that here, and we can discuss it more at the hands-on workshops. Okay, there are several general categories of disease. We've got leaf spots or foliar diseases like fungal or bacterial spots, powdery mildews and downy mildews. There's viruses. We have wilt-causing diseases, root rots, which are mostly caused by fungi, and nematodes. So the leaf spots and most viruses are considered foliar diseases, where the pathogens or the insects that spread them have major life stages above ground, and they tend to cause symptoms in above ground plant parts. The wilts, root rots, and most nematodes are soil-borne, with most of their life cycle underground. They colonize the plants via the roots. As an important side note, don't forget that most microbes are beneficial both in the soil and on plant surfaces. Okay, there are a lot of different kinds of fungal leaf spots. Here is a list of just a few on cucurbits and tomato. The different references can tell you all about different specific diseases in more detail. As a general common thread, nearly all fungal leaf spot pathogens reproduce by spores that are spread in wet weather, and they infect wet plant surfaces, like when the leaves are wet from rain or overhead irrigation. Some fungal pathogens can be introduced to a site on seed or transplants. Many fungal leaf spot pathogens survive from one year to the next on infected crop residue, but we don't actually call them soil-borne even if they spend that part of their life kind of down in the soil in that crop debris. Some foliar pathogens, such as the powdery mildews and downy mildews, can be blown in from a distance, and this presents some additional management challenges. For example, crop rotation may not be very helpful because the pathogen isn't even overwintering in that site. The pathogen is coming in from somewhere else. Okay, here's one fungal leaf spot. This happens to be Septoria leaf spot on tomato, and we can see the symptoms here on the leaf. With the leaf spots, there is the leaf death at the spot itself, and then often the plant suffers defoliation. This leads to a decrease in photosynthesis, decreased yield, and decreased crop quality. So we can zoom in for a little closer view. And zooming in even closer, we can dissect the spots in the microscope to view the spores, which are what actually cause the disease spread. Fungal spores are very tiny. With Septoria, in 1 inch, if you line them up end to end, you could fit 1,000 spores. These spores are produced during wet, humid weather, and they germinate and infect on wet leaf surfaces. Here is a zoom of a powdery mildew colony growing on a leaf surface. Let's look in closer. In the microscope, we can see the tiny spores or conidia. So each little circle here, like a little glass bead, is a spore that could cause a new infection. And powdery mildew spores spread easily in the wind. All right, along with fungi, there are many bacteria that cause leaf spots in vegetables. Here's a short list of a few that we see in Kansas. Bacteria are very different from fungi, but they have a few things in common. Like many fungi, many plant pathogenic bacteria are spread in wet weather and they infect wet plant surfaces. Some can be introduced on infected seed or infected transplants, and like some of the fungi, many of them can survive from one year to the next in crop residue. Here is one example of a bacterial spot. Some bacterial diseases have a bright yellow halo around the brown leaf spot, but that's not 100% diagnostic. There are many exceptions, and other problems can have a yellow color. I just wanted to show you that example, because a number of the bacterial diseases do have that halo. Okay, there are many different viruses in vegetables, and viral symptoms can be quite unique, with mottled colors, mosaic patterns, ring spots, and distortion. And you can see examples of different kinds of those symptoms here in the photos. Virus-infected plants are infected for life, and there is no cure for virus-infected plants. At a small scale, simply roguing out infected plants to prevent further spread can be a good management option. Some viruses are spread by seed or infected transplants. Some are spread simply by handling the sick plants and then touching healthy ones, because you're spreading sap from one plant to another. And a lot of different plant viruses are spread by insects. The exact method depends on exactly which virus it is. And with different mechanisms of spread, the management options might vary. The vegetable guide I mentioned earlier and other references can help growers strategize to minimize their virus risk. Diagnosis of viral diseases can be tricky. The viruses themselves are too small to see in the microscope, but at diagnostic labs there are other methods available to detect certain viruses. Vectors are insects that spread disease. For example, in the human health world, mosquitoes are vectors of West Nile virus and other diseases. In the plant world, whiteflies, aphids, and thrips are some of the most important vectors of plant diseases, of various plant viruses. So therefore, insect management can help prevent the threat of certain viruses. Root and crown rots are caused by soil-borne fungi and oomycetes. In this photo, we can see a dark discoloration in the crown and roots. There's also a lack of fine feeder roots. Some root rots cause a mushy texture in the roots, and the tissue easily sloughs apart. Root rots are more likely in wet soils with poor drainage, so overall site, soil, and water management is critical for preventing these diseases. Nematodes are microscopic worms. There are many beneficial nematodes, but the plant parasitic ones all have a needle-like mouth part called a stylet, like you see in this photo here. The nematode uses that stylet to puncture into plant cells and draw out the nutrients. Most plant parasitic nematodes live in the soil and they attack the roots, and the root damage causes stunting and yellowing and a general decline. So that's what you would see above ground, and it's often in clumps of plants, like aggregate clumps. Some nematodes cause swellings or root deformations. So this root symptom on the left is a normal one. The root system on the right shows a lot of swellings, which is caused by the root knot nematode, a common pathogen on lots of different kinds of vegetables. Okay, we'll talk about wilt diseases now. Wilt symptoms can be caused by many factors, including just drought stress, but with the true wilt diseases, a pathogen colonizes the water conducting system in the plant, and that's what causes the wilt. The infections usually result in death, and in the meantime, plant growth can be slowed and yields are reduced. Two common wilt diseases in vegetables are fusarium wilt and verticillium wilt, which are two fungal diseases, and I'll touch on those more in a little while when I talk about the specific tomato diseases. Okay, so now I will talk in pretty general terms about disease management strategies. Ideally, a grower will be integrating multiple strategies. So remember that disease triangle concept? We should try to implement multiple strategies that disrupt multiple sides of that disease triangle. Resistant varieties are an important foundation for disease management, and resistant varieties are available for some diseases, but not for all. Having a good idea of which diseases are most common in your area or which you have a history with will help you know which varieties to focus on. And various references can help you select those varieties. Another important disease prevention strategy is to avoid introducing the pathogen to your site. Some diseases are seed-borne, so make sure you use clean seed from a trusted source. There are seed treatments to reduce the risk of some disease, and the Midwest Vegetable Guide that I mentioned earlier actually has some information on seed treatments. If you use transplants, take a very good look at them before introducing them to your operation. Look at both the above ground parts and also the root system, because the last thing you want to do is introduce a disease into your facility or your field with planting material. Many diseases are more common in wet conditions. So many root routes are most active in saturated soils. So you can use raised beds and improve drainage to help reduce the risk of those kinds of diseases. Many foliar pathogens will only infect the plant if the leaf surfaces are wet. So to reduce that risk, with some crops, like tomato, you can use staking or trellising to help improve airflow. Use appropriate plant spacing to try to improve airflow. There are many benefits of growing certain high crops in a high tunnel, and one benefit is in that semi-controlled environment, there's a lack of leaf wetness and lack of rain to splash some of those foliar pathogens around. Many plant diseases are most active in humid conditions, so you can also reduce humidity in greenhouses and high tunnels with proper ventilation. Some pathogens carry over from one season to the next in crop debris. Infected plant debris can also be a source of a pathogen within the same season. So when feasible, you can remove diseased plants and keep the culls away from the production site. Some pathogens can survive on weeds, so weed management is important. Tillage to bury infected plant debris can reduce the threat of the pathogen carrying over for some diseases. However, of course, in a no-till system, that's not an option. So in no-till systems, you're going to need extra vigilance and be sure to use integrated management incorporating other methods to help reduce your overall disease risk, since tillage won't be an option for you. So as I've mentioned a couple times already, disease management relies on a holistic approach, not just one tactic. Crop rotation is a great option for reducing the risk of some diseases. Basically, by using crop rotation, appropriate crop rotation, you can disrupt the survival of the pathogen by basically starving it of a host plant food source. Crop rotation is not always practical. Some pathogens can survive a very long time, even in the absence of a host, making rotation difficult. And some pathogens have a very wide host range, making it difficult to choose plants that are not hosts to use as rotation crops. Some cover crops may be hosts as well, so that's another consideration when you're selecting cover crops. I won't go into any detail at all about chemical control in this webinar. The Midwest Guide that I've mentioned a few times is one source for information on both conventional and organic products. To choose the right materials, you definitely need to know which diseases you're dealing with, and proper timing, rate, and application method are essential. This guide is updated each year with current information. So with so many diseases, it can seem daunting to think about putting it all together to make a plan, but with some practice and experience, you can start to see some patterns. Here is part of a table from that Midwest Guide, and it lists different crops, the common diseases on those crops, and then there are columns related to some of the cultural practices. So here, let's zoom in here and we'll just look at cantaloupe for a minute. Here is the column of diseases, and we'll just look at some of the pieces here. Here's the crop rotation column. You can see that crop rotation is an option for many of those diseases, and the 2 there means a 2-year crop rotation, and the 3 means a 3-year crop rotation, so there's some information there. We'll look at the resistant varieties column, and for these diseases on cantaloupe, actually resistance is only an option for one of them. And the table also makes a note that root knot nematode has a wide host range, which would make crop rotation and cover crop selection tricky. Okay, in this part of the presentation, we will quickly step through a few tomato diseases, and we'll try to put some of these concepts together. Here are some photos of Septoria leaf spot. We saw a picture of that earlier. It's a fungal leaf spot disease. The plant suffers defoliation, which reduces photosynthesis, reduces yield, and exposes the fruit to sun scald. It's very common in Kansas. The fungus spreads from plant to plant, or from leaf to leaf in rain splash or in overhead irrigation. The water splashes those spores around that I showed you before, and it survives from year to year in infected plant debris. This photo shows another fungal foliar disease, or leaf spot. This one is called early blight. And just like Septoria, the spores are spread in wet conditions, and it survives year to year in crop debris. And finally, here's Anthracnose. It's a fungal fruit rot, and it also spreads in wet conditions and survives in crop debris. So let's talk about managing those diseases based on their common biology. For all of these, all 3 of those diseases I just showed you, crop rotation is an option. Staking or stringing or caging those tomatoes will help promote airflow and reduce leaf wetness, making the environment less conducive to disease. Using mulches will help prevent spores in the crop debris from splashing up into the plant. Use drip irrigation instead of overhead. This will both save water and reduce the leaf wetness that promotes the disease. If feasible, like on a small scale, you can clean up crop debris at the end of the season to reduce that carryover. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the huge benefits of growing in a high tunnel is the ability to reduce leaf wetness and eliminate the rain splash that could spread disease. Okay, so that prior little section touched on a couple of fungal diseases, and now I will mention some bacterial fruit and leaf spots. So first, here is a tomato disease called bacterial speck, where the pathogen causes spotting on both the leaves and the fruit. And here is bacterial spot. The foliar and leaf spots are a little bit bigger than those for speck. So both of these diseases can be spread or introduced to a site on seed and transplants, so starting with clean plant material is essential. And this will reduce the threat of some other diseases too, including bacterial canker, which I didn't really show here, but which can be a nasty problem. For spec, resistant varieties are available, so if you have especially a history of spec, you might want to consider those. And then pretty much all those same things I mentioned for the fungal leaf and fruit spots will also work to reduce the bacterial diseases. Okay, those are some foliar diseases, and now we'll switch and quickly discuss a couple of soil-borne diseases. So verticillium, fusarium wilt, and root knot nematode occur in Kansas. They are not super common, but they do occur here, and they are the most common ones that we see in Kansas. Verticillium wilt is caused by the fungus Verticillium dahliae, and it causes wilting and leaf necrosis, or leaf browning, and the plant is weakened and can die, and yields are reduced. The fungus survives a long time in the soil as a survival structure called a microsclerotia, up to 14 years, and that makes crop rotation not very feasible. If the fungus can just sit there surviving, it's very hard to rotate away from it. So this picture shows a microscopic image of a microsclerotia. Here are some more symptoms of the disease. So we see the symptoms on the leaves, and some wilt in the plant, and another image showing those microsclerotia in some plant tissue. Verticillium has a very wide host range, including tomato, potato, eggplant, strawberry, artichoke, beet, cucumber, and lots more crops. It can also infect some weeds. Grasses are resistant, so like corn and wheat are not susceptible. And with this big, wide host range, crop rotation can be difficult, and cover crop selection can be difficult. So if you have a site where you have a known history of verticillium wilt, you'll need to take that into consideration. Fortunately, resistant tomato varieties are available. Another option, if you have a history of verticillium wilt in tomato, is to use a resistant rootstock. That is, if you want to grow a fruiting variety that is not resistant, you can graft onto rootstocks that are resistant. So this picture shows a little grafted seedling where we've got the rootstock that would have resistance to the disease. It goes through a grafting process, and then your desired scion cultivar goes on top. Grafting is a complicated topic that I'm not going to go over in any detail here, but we could discuss it at the hands-on workshops if you have questions. Fusarium wilt is another fungal wilt in tomato. It causes wilting, yellowing of the leaves, and if you slice into the stem, you'll see some brown streaking in the xylem. I forgot to mention that verticillium can also cause some browning in the xylem. For comparison, here are some views of normal, healthy stem tissue without any of that brown streaking. Unlike verticillium, fusarium has a more narrow host range, but many solanaceous crops are susceptible. So crop rotation is an option, but you still just need to be careful about rotating away from solanaceous hosts. And it's not as big of a problem as for verticillium. So cover crop selection will be a lot easier for fusarium than for verticillium. There are resistant tomato varieties for fusarium wilt, and you'll see that in the seed catalog. Here's kind of one just random example I pulled that mentions resistance to fusarium. It also mentions resistance to verticillium. And there are also resistant rootstocks. So again, if you want to produce a fruiting variety that is not resistant, you can use grafted plants where the rootstock is resistant. But you have to make sure you choose the right rootstock. The last tomato disease I'll mention is root knot nematodes, and these cause galling in roots in tomato and lots of other vegetables. It has a very wide host range. There are several different species of root knot nematode, and they cause the disruption of the root tissue, and this leads to stunting and poor vigor. On the left, we see a normal tomato root system, and on the right, we see the severe swelling caused by root knot nematode. If we use a microscope and slice into those swellings, we can see the adult female root knot nematode. They're kind of pear-shaped. This one is laying eggs out into a gooey matrix. Root knot nematode is a huge host range, including many crops and many weeds. Grasses are non-hosts, so with that wide host range, crop rotation and cover crop selection will be more difficult. So there's implications for crop rotation and cover crop selection if you have a site with a history of root knot nematode. There are resistant tomato varieties, and grafting onto resistant rootstocks is an option. I know it's hard to see here on this slide, but here again is a reminder that references such as the Midwest Guide can summarize a lot of this information in an easy to digest way, and growers can use this kind of table to help manage diseases in an integrated fashion. Okay, so this brings us to the end of this introductory webinar about vegetable diseases, so we'll take a glance at those goals again. So hopefully you got some tips on diagnosing at least a few vegetable diseases and tips on distinguishing abiotic from biotic problems. We talked about the general categories of vegetable diseases and their biology. We talked about some general management practices, and then we looked at a couple specific tomato diseases as a case study. So again, that's the end of this webinar, and we'll be following up at the hands-on workshops, and as an optional follow-up to those, we will have that online learning community in the fall or winter.